Good evening. I'm Lenore Colthart, and it's my honour on behalf of the current team of Women's History Month Australia organisers to warmly welcome you here tonight to Canberra's beautiful Albert Hall. Together, we recognise those on whose country we meet, the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people. Women's History Month Australia, as you'll know, has run from the year 2000, and this will be the last Women's History Month Australia event. It's a great contrast, particularly with the situation in the United States. And if you're familiar with the website womenshistorymonth.gov, which says it all, you'll be familiar with the fact that in Washington, for instance, the US National Archives, the Smithsonian, the Library of Congress, the National Park Service, as well as schools across the states, celebrate Women's History Month every year with an extraordinary range of events. In our national capital this March, I noticed a nice little display in the Kingston Library. Former Women's History Month Australia organisers here include one of the earliest teams, Gillian Pollack, and it was she who reminded me that the founder of Women's History Month Australia, Helen Leonard, gathered that first group together saying, "Our US sisters have Congress, we'll have coffee," and they went off to Gus's. That's pretty much the point of the evening. A particular welcome to those parliamentarians are here, and a thanks to those who took the trouble to send apologies and special greetings. In particular, Senator Kate Lundy, Senator Christine Milne, and Senator Moore. We are sorry that they're not able to be here. As you probably know, the Senate is still keeping them busy. We even had a quite brief note of greetings, certainly nothing like President Obama's speech every year for Women's History Month, from the Prime Minister, who wished us well for this evening. It's now my very great pleasure to introduce our chair for the evening, Genevieve Jacobs.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening to you. What an absolutely terrific roll-up for this final debate on Women's History Month, the last ring of the bell for the month itself, as Lenore's just told you. And that is at the heart of what we're here to discuss, that Australia doesn't need Women's History Month. Now, by debate, what I mean is a cracking good argument here in Albert Hall. So be warned, this is no tea time chat. This is no gaggle of girls cosily swapping gentle thoughts because, yeah, like that ever happens outside Hollywood at least. Tonight's the real deal. 6 women possessed of informed, strong opinions that they are very ready to share and to defend. And I am particularly glad to be standing in the middle of this one because, and this may not surprise any of you who listen to me on the radio on 666 ABC Canberra, I'm an old debater myself. I'm a Catholic schools champion, an Archdale finalist. I was the first speaker, and I took great pleasure in mowing down those cocky boys. That's what an education with the nuns will do for you. Let me, though, introduce you to the speakers. Arguing for the affirmative, the government, plenty of dames, no knights as far as I can see. I said, look, let me warn you, at this stage I am not planning to implement Speaker Bronwyn Bishop's no laughing rule, but just behave yourselves. Let's start, though, with Professor Marilyn Lake, who will begin the argument. She's a University of Melbourne historian and current president of the Australian Historic... I'm sorry, I've been given the wrong order. Professor Angela Woolacott, who is the Manning Clark Professor of History at the ANU and the editor of the Cambridge University Press History for the Australian Curriculum, and a wide array of other works about women and history. Dawn Casey is also well known to many of you here. She's chair of the Indigenous Land Corporation, the founding director of the National Museum of Australia. She's been director of the Powerhouse Museum and also CEO of the Western Australian Museum. Arguing for the negative, the opposition, I must say, as a debater myself, the topic that includes a negative is a difficult one to construe. But a team who should have no difficulties with this, and I go from my left, Alex Briggs, who's an ANU student, a national and international debater, and therefore also probably used to wiping the floor with cocky boys. She's a former Young Australian Historian of the Year. Next to her, Professor Marnie Hughes-Warrington, someone with whom I've had the pleasure of regular duels in the studio. She takes the questioning very well indeed. She's Deputy Vice-Chancellor of the ANU, an historian and the author of 6 books, including last year's Revisionist Histories. She's a winner of the Prime Minister's Award for University Teacher of the Year. And on the end, Dr. Anne Summers, a distinguished writer and columnist who is one of Australia's leading feminists. An editor and publisher, she was the head of Australia's Office of the Status of Women under Paul Keating and wrote the landmark book Damned Whores and God's Police and The Misogyny Factor. Her website, Looking Glass, has thousands of readers. I'll introduce you a little later on to our panel of adjudicators, but suffice to say that they're more than up to the task. We'll begin the debate in a moment. Each speaker will have strictly 6 minutes each with a warning bell at 5 minutes. And as Lenore told you, after we've heard from everyone, the adjudicators will withdraw to consider their decision for 10 minutes or so. But then you get your chance to put your questions to the team. We're going to have a little time together with a microphone in the middle of the floor here. So I'll ask you to queue up to that microphone so we can all hear what you've got to say. And while the adjudicators are out of the room and have no idea what's going on, we're going to vote and we won't tell them what happens. So you, the people, will be making your own decision. We'll then consult the adjudicators when they return. In this instance, I think they're playing probably a fairly similar role to the Australian Electoral Commission. And the people's vote will be revealed. Will they be one and the same or entirely different? And then we will adjourn for nibbles and consider what we've all learnt as citizens, people and women. And I now invite the first speaker for the affirmative for the government to open the debate.
Thank you, Genevieve. Australia needs women's history. In fact, it needs it so badly that it needs not just a month, but women's history all year. I commend the Australian Women's History Forum for their hard and creative work over the last decade in launching and staging Women's History Month in Australia. It has done much to bring women's history to public attention, certainly here in Canberra. Over the last 25 years, I have organised, spoken at and attended many Women's History Month events, including some in Ohio at my former university. In the United States, where Women's History Month became a national event in 1987, campuses across the country celebrate March in this way, just as in February they commemorate Black History Month. Indeed, now with a growing calendar of commemorative months, Women's History Month shares March along with Irish American Heritage Month, while April is Confederate History Month, and May celebrates 4 other aspects of American heritage, along with National Pet Month and National Bike Month. From an academic perspective, Women's History Month has been one factor among many, building women's and gender history as a thriving field. For a subdiscipline that only took off in the 1970s, women's and gender history is strikingly successful, with an annual conference in Australia, international organisations and conferences, and many journals, such as Lilith, the Journal of Feminist History, Journal of Women's History, Women's History Review, and Gender in History, to name a few. History departments in Australia and overseas now have more women at senior levels than many other disciplines. Just on our team tonight, we have both the President, Marilyn, and myself, the Vice President of the Australian Historical Association. Yet, university courses in women's and gender history face a challenging environment. Despite its transformative successes as an academic field of research, including at the postgraduate level, women's history today faces widespread sexism in the media and political culture, and a wrong-headed complacency about gender issues. We need to do more to promote women's history in the mass media, in our national cultural institutions, on social media, and in film, television, and radio. Hence, we need women's history in February, May, July, and September as much as we need it in March. We need women's history on the 26th of January, Australia Day, to show the contributions women have made to the nation, not least Aboriginal women's contributions to the resilience of Indigenous communities and to the work and culture of the nation in many facets. We greatly need Women's History on the 25th of April, Anzac Day, to challenge the focus on men's part in the Anzac legend and to remind the nation that women have contributed to Australia's expeditionary and defence forces as soldiers, nurses and doctors, and in many other ways, while at the same time women have suffered from war as casualties themselves, from war's multiple forms of violence, through bereavement, and through disproportionately caring for the wounded and disabled. We need Women's History all year as one front in the ongoing battles for women, including for actual equal pay, for greater representation in the Cabinet, in Parliament, on boards, in the senior levels of management, and in leading film and TV roles. We need to deploy Women's History to help the young feminists who are currently trying to persuade their peers that feminism is not a dirty word. In the Sydney Morning Herald a few months ago, 18-year-old Jemima Cooper was bold enough to write of her daily battles with her friends and family over gender issues and feminism, concluding with the observation, quote, "I'm sick of feeling as if wanting equality between genders is some massive ask which designates you as angry and demanding," end quote. Young feminists need to know about all of the women role models who have preceded them, like the many women who have succeeded against difficult odds and against misogynist criticism. They need to know the story, for example, of Thea Proctor, the modernist artist whose work was showcased recently in the Sydney Moderns exhibition at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, and who was a major cultural contributor in the interwar decades. Proctor's success was in spite of the blatant misogyny of prominent artist Norman Lindsay, who described Proctor as dangerous as a diseased germ, unquote, and tried to have her work excluded from a major exhibition of Australian art in London. Not only young feminists, but all Australians, is that the 5 or the 6? Not only young feminists, but all Australians need to know these stories and so many others, like the inspiring stories of Aboriginal rights activists Pearl Gibbs and Faith Bandler. Moreover, Australians should know enough about women's history to grapple with its surprising aspects, such as the fact that it took until 1943 for women to be elected to the Commonwealth Parliament. For all of these reasons, we need Women's History for more than 1 month. We need it from the 1st of January to the 31st of December every year. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. And I'd now like to ask the opposition to begin their argument with the first speaker, Alex Biggs.
I stand before you today, a student, a debater, a historian, but most importantly, a woman who wants more from our education system, from our teachers and academics, from our community. I want Women's History Month. We've inherited a great legacy, a legacy that is all too easily generalised and swept over as insignificant. All too often, Australian women are kept in the shadows of history. Unnamed figures who followed their husbands in migrating to Australia, who waved our soldiers off to war, or who prepared the home-cooked meals that greeted great men home. But we know, and the opposition agrees with us, that our women have done so much more than that, and to forget them is a crime against our mothers, our grandmothers, our history. And so, ladies and gentlemen, today I am proud to stand for Australian Women's History Month's continuing and necessary role, along with Marnie and Anne, 2 women who I am both in awe of and proud to be standing beside. I will set forward the case for keeping Australian Women's History Month in Australia. I will be addressing the educational need, and Marnie will be examining state intervention and efficacy of communication. I'd like to begin, though, by addressing the argument posed by the affirmative team in this evening's debate, They tried to tell us that we need women's history all year, and we thank her for her support of our importance that we place on women's history and its continuing importance all year round in Australia. And yet we on the opposition believe that to do so, to remove Women's History Month from our agenda, would overall diminish women's history. It would blur it back into the background, back where it was before we had this sharp focus on women's history for at least 1 month a year. Without this focus on women's history provided by Women's History Month, it will suffer from a lack of exposure and budget. Women's history without a focus is out of focus, and Women's History Month is what we need to bring it back to attention. Yes, we would love it if this attention multiplied, but it needs to begin somewhere, and we think that is with Women's History Month. We don't trust our educators, academics, and politicians to make this an issue from April through to February, and that's why we need March. We need a month where focus is placed on women's history and the role it has in Australia. But now I'd like to begin my case by asking the question, why do we need to learn about the history of women in Australia? Every generation, ladies and gentlemen, needs to learn its past so that we can imagine a future in which gender equality is the norm and not the exception. I want all girls to remember the women who fought for universal suffrage, who campaigned for better working conditions and equal pay, who systematically broke down the barriers and obstacles facing them. These women are our history and our heritage. And I'm not afraid of my ambition, if only because I know that I am in the historical shadow of great Australian women, both recognised and forgotten. And what's more, I don't just want all girls to learn about these women, I want everyone to. Women's history is Australians' history, and every single one of us benefits from a greater knowledge of it. Women's history is no token subset of history for the politically correct. It's the account of what is now a majority of our community. So after 10 years of promotion, do we need to continue with Women's History Month? Or is it now obsolete, given that we've had a female Prime Minister, a female Governor-General, a female Head of State? I refute this on 2 counts. Firstly, as anyone who follows Australian public life or politics can tell you, these women are unfortunately all too often the exception. There are so many more battlefields that face women and so many more histories that need to be written. Secondly, in order not to celebrate these achievements, we must not forget them and the women whose arduous struggle means that I can vote, get equal wages, and receive a world standard education. I'd secondly like to examine women's history as an underrepresented and under-recognised part of Australian history, and why this necessitates Australian Women's History Month. I've told you that women for far too long have been condemned to the margins of textbooks and the footnotes of essays. And if you don't believe me, believe this. Out of over 12,500 individuals listed in the Australian Dictionary of Biography, only 1,531 are women. You could point at the fact that for centuries academia was dominated by men, or that our leadership was dominated by men. Or you could sit up and acknowledge that women represent far more than 12% of our national story. Ladies and gentlemen, we are so far off achieving a balanced understanding of women's roles in Australian history. And it is for this reason that we need Australian Women's History Month, so that at the very least, for 1 month a year, our society can remember and learn from the women who shaped Australia. It is an educational and intellectual necessity to combat the ignorance that lets communities forget that names like Chisholm and Gilmore mean so much more than Canberra suburbs. Women's History Month has proven itself as a viable and successful means of disseminating the knowledge that all of us should be expected to know. For 10 years, Women's History Month has kept the community engaged and aware. So every March, we need to do more than just wear our purple ribbons on International Women's Day. We need to remember and to learn. We need Australian Women's History Month. Thank you.
That was a beautifully timed bit of debating, wasn't it? Lovely rebuttal. I'm noticing the technicalities. Taking up the argument for the affirmative, Dawn Casey.
Thank you. As I look back over time, I feel privileged to have been part of, and in some cases instrumental in the development of government policies and programs for women and Australia's Indigenous people. They include Australia's first Equal Opportunity Plan in 1984, the first reconciliation process in the 90s, and the development and construction of the National Museum of Australia, which opened here in Canberra in 2001. Dare I forget it? I learnt very early in my life the importance of identifying strategies for the environment of the day to ensure a successful outcome. In 2014, I do not believe that we need the continuation of Women's History Month. We need to ask ourselves, what is the benefit of such an event? How does it contribute to increasing the numbers of students studying history? What contribution does it make to gender equity in the workforce, including directorships on major company boards? I would suggest very little. Are we simply preaching to the converted? To continue the status quo does not take into account the current views of the broader Australian society and the change in demographics. Just take, for example, the Indigenous population. 55% of our population is 24 years or younger, and only 3% are 65 years and over. For museums, where I was director, we found more women than men tended to visit social history exhibitions. And for the 40 years and under age group, it is extremely difficult to engage them. Many of our young women don't fully understand or appreciate why we have Australia Women's History Month. Partly for the reason of the contribution of women is being recognised and celebrated in a range of ways. The history of Australia's contribution in times of war is now featured in the Australian War Memorial. A number of amazing women have been recognised as Australian of the Year, including Professor Fiona Stanley, Dr. Loa Jo Donoghue, and Quentin Bryce has just completed a highly successful term as Australia's very first Governor-General. The Honourable Julie Gillard did it very tough as Australia's first female Prime Minister. Women's autobiographies and biographies are being published. A couple of my favourites are Jessie Street and Doris Pilkington. Jessie was born into privilege but didn't allow that to blind her to the many injustices of the world. She was subjected to all those pressures that women experience, but she persistently and courageously campaigned for peace, social justice and equality for women and citizenship for Indigenous Australians. Doris Pilkington's story was made popular through film, The Rabbit-Proof Fence, as were the stories of Lois Peeler, Lauren Robinson, Beverly Briggs and Naomi Myers through the movie The Sapphires. As I recall, not only was it viewed by the wider Australian population, it was also Australia's highest-grossing film internationally. Is women's history important? Absolutely. But we do need to look seriously at how we engage our young people and the wider Australian community to appreciate the importance of the history of women in Australia. To this end, I make no apology for promoting the use of popular culture as a medium to engage the young and old alike in women's history. Millions of people now know the stories of those Aboriginal women I just mentioned as a result of the movies than they would have through Women's History Month activities. I'm concerned in the current climate, Women's History Month could be seen as only symbolic. Symbolism is important, but in itself does not change attitudes. Nelson Mandela wrote in his autobiography, "From the moment the results were in and it was apparent that the ANC was to form government, I saw my mission as one of preaching reconciliation, of binding the wounds of the country, of engendering trust and confidence. I knew that many people, particularly minorities, whites, coloureds and Indians, would be feeling anxious about the future, and I wanted them to feel secure. I reminded people again and again that the liberation struggle was not a battle against any one group or colour, but a fight against a system of repression. I feel we are again in a time in Australia where a system of repression appears to be emerging. We're supporters of an Australian history that recognises the perspectives of Indigenous people, women, immigrants, gays and a multitude of previously overlooked or suppressed voices will be marginalised. The proposal by the government to change the national curriculum, and well, they've seen today that they're going to continue counting stats. As women, we can't allow ourselves to be marginalised again or lose the gains made. Therefore, instead of continuing to dedicate time and resources to Women's History Month, we need to redirect these resources and efforts and link with the other groups to ensure women's history and Australian history overall is not lost for our future generations.
Thank you, Dawn. Vibrantly and beautifully expressed. To continue the argument, I'm going to call on Marnie Hughes-Warrington.
Ladies and gentlemen, so far this debate has turned on the principle of education and the right to education and the efficacy of education. What a tempting offer you've been given. You've been promised a Women's History Year. What a sensational offer, so beguiling, so tempting, so marvellous, so operationalised. Can you see the budget disappearing and women disappearing into the background? I rebut thee by wearing the blue tie of history. Sisters, I'm here, and gentlemen, here to stand for the right for women to stand up and to deserve focus, because too often we are put in the background. We are operationalised. Our issues are described as systemic and nothing changes, and we need change. And it's incumbent upon the opposition, although it might talk about young people and social media, to demonstrate that we will be no worse off through the loss of Women's History Month, and they have not demonstrated that as yet. I'm going to reiterate Alex's point that this is really a debate about a right to education, and that the state, having already intervened in declaring a connection between citizenship and history, has a right to stand for all its citizens, and that if it does not do so, that it leads to economic harm, and that we also need to take advantage of its means of communication. So let's come to education. Without sustained, focused Women's History Month, what do we have? We have the internet. I researched this very carefully. You can go out there right now and there are great sites called the 10 worst mums in history. Number 2 on the list, a wolf spider. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm here to say a wolf spider is not a person. It is not a person. Then you can go on the internet and you can find a list, the 10 most influential women in history. Number 1, Madonna. And those of you who might be wondering, not the mother of Jesus, the other one, okay? You can go on the internet and you can find fan fiction. Ladies and gentlemen, Phryne Fisher is not real, okay? Rose did not stop the Titanic from sinking. These things did not happen. We need the help. We need focus and we need better education. And without concerted effort, we drift back into the background and into a situation where Phryne Fisher becomes the most interesting thing in women's history that never happened for Australia. The second thing is, unless we make a concerted effort and we focus, particular parts of women's history come into focus and other things blur into the background. And in fact, the thing that comes into focus most is 20th century women's history. And more than that, first and second wave feminism. Now, I'd just like to say at this point that the adjudicators, you look far too young to be second wave feminists. You're way too young. And Tony, you're a man, okay? I'd like to say at this point that we need more than first and second wave feminism. We deserve more, okay? No disrespect, second wave feminists here in the audience. I know you burnt your bras. I saw the Gough Whitlam ads. It's been proven, okay? We know that you fought for the vote and that's gone really well. motoring enthusiast party, okay? And we know that you fought for wage equality and we haven't achieved it yet. We've got a lot of work to do, and we need to draw upon the resources, not just of the 20th century women's history, but long and wide. People like Christine Tibazan, who taught us about how to think about the state, the author of the ancient text, Women Intelligent and Courageous in Warfare, women who fought without husbands. Sarah Hale's argument in 1850 that God invented women second because he got them right. And we also need arguments from Lydia Child's efforts to promote education right through to her recognition of the importance of Indigenous women. We cannot let this blur into the background and simply allow ourselves to become business as usual because the business ain't finished. So why should the state carry this function? Well, an important thing to argue is that the state is here to prevent harm but also to save costs. They should like this one, okay? I'm not going to argue that this is a life and death issue, but women who are not well educated about their opportunities and their rights are susceptible. And we live in a nation where women unfortunately have not achieved pay equality, and they retire and have longer life expectancy and have fewer financial resources. They are vulnerable because they have not had the opportunity to achieve equality. They need all the resources at their hand to achieve that equality. We need the government to intervene as it already has done, showing deep interest in the history syllabus and getting out there and promoting the cause of women, and doing so with its communication means, because we know 85% of students have studied Nazi Germany in New South Wales. Good on them, but I want to know that 85% of them have studied women and know what they have in terms of opportunities in future life. The state has these means at its disposal. It can't be left to the private sector. Terrible mobile phone coverage. The state has the means of reaching rural and disadvantaged communities and making sure that women who are the most vulnerable hear what is important, hear it in focus, and make sure that we achieve what has not been achieved, equality and a place in history and not in the background. Thank you.
It's always a winner when you bring along a prop, isn't it? Yes, no, go. It's a classic debating trick. Thank you very much, Marnie. And I'd now like to invite Professor Marilyn Lake to conclude the case for the government.
Ladies and gentlemen, members of the opposition and my fellow members of the government. In summing up the government's proposition that Australia doesn't need Women's History Month, and in refuting the opposition's arguments, I want to suggest that women's history is too important, too significant and too substantial and too diverse to be relegated to just 1 month of the year, to 1 month in 12, leaving 11 months, in effect, to men's history. Women's history is not some sort of optional, seasonal, come March, extra. It's central to every aspect of the national story. It's relevant every month, every week, every day. It's especially fitting, I think, that we acknowledge Indigenous peoples of this country on an occasion like this, because their historical associations with this place are so much longer than the historical links of settlers and their descendants. Paying attention to the experience of Indigenous peoples reminds us, as Dawn has reminded us, of the complexity of women's history, that women's history includes women as both colonisers and colonised. She reminds us of the intertwined nature of women's history, Indigenous women's history and Indigenous men's history. And she and Angela remind us too of the centrality of Indigenous women to family, community and national history, including the history of our democracy. Think, for example, of the activists Margaret Tucker, Pearl Gibbs, Louisa Briggs, Oodgeroo Noonuccal, Lowitja O'Donoghue. Now, the opposition would have us believe that Women's History Month provides a focus. Well, a focus for 1 month. That it's necessary, otherwise women might continue to walk in men's shadow.
that Women's History Month is somehow necessary to achieving equality for women today in the workforce, in politics, in Parliament. I think you'll agree with me that there's not much evidence of the relationship between those things. The government proposes that we no longer need Women's History Month because, as our first speaker, Angela Woolacott, suggested, we need women's history every month. And also because, as Dawn suggested, women's history now is communicated to audiences across our country in such a wide variety of forms, including museums and movies, all the time, and to a wide variety of audiences, the young, the old, men and women. Now, in summing up, I want to make 3 points. First, that women's history is too significant to be consigned to 1 month out of 12, as if it's somehow an exception, an appendage, an add-on to the national story. The truth is that women have been central to all aspects of our history, to settlement and dispossession, to work and welfare, to sexuality and religion, to citizenship and democracy. I was recently asked by an American journal, the Journal of Women's History, to write a survey of Australian women's history over that time, over the last 25 years. And my research assistant, Leanne Monk, and I got together and did research for this, and we found that there were over 1,000 publications in Australia on Australian women's history. Women's history in Australia has in fact been a terrific collective achievement. This provides great intellectual resources for the country. Much of it, of course, is now online, and it's available to everyone, to museums, media, filmmakers, teachers and writers. Women's history has been a hugely successful enterprise in Australia, even if it hasn't quite made it to the ADB, and it's transformed our understanding of the past. The second point is that there's a methodological problem with separating women's history from other history, as if women's lives were lived separately from general historical processes. As the late great feminist historian, the Australian feminist historian Kay Daniels pointed out in her landmark 2-volume work on historical records called Women in Australia, women have been integral to historical processes and relationships in the past. Whether we study convicts or country life, factory workers or shopkeepers, conscription debates or the anti-war movement, raising babies or growing apples, women have been central to all these things. If we institutionalise women's history in its own separate category, set aside in its own 1 month, we institutionalise women's marginality to national life. Finally, the real problem is not women's history, it's men's history, and its massive resurgence in the guise of military history during the last 10 or 15 years. As both speakers on the government side have suggested, we live in newly reactionary repressive times, and here in Canberra, which bristles with monuments to war, with more being built seemingly every minute, men's military history is omnipresent, massively financed by federal government agencies. And at the heart of it all is the preposterous, ludicrous proposition that at Gallipoli, men gave birth to the nation. Now, we know that men can do many things. I know men have many capabilities, but one thing they cannot do is give birth to anything. It's women who give birth, who have given birth to the citizens who comprise the nation, who tend to babies and look after families, who sustain communities and keep the whole show going. So I want to finish, finally, to suggest that we should challenge the fictions that parade in our society and restore women's agency to the centre of national life. Thank you.
Marilyn, thank you. I think that was a clarion call, wasn't it? I recognise those. There has been note passing to my right. There has been muttering. The classics of the debate have been taking place, whispered confrontations. People may have even checked their iPhones for details. I don't believe that was banned. To conclude the debate for the opposition, please welcome Dr. Anne Summers.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I do feel sorry for the other team. They are trying to make an arguable argument, and strident as they were in their efforts to do so, they have failed busily. I do feel a little bit sorry for them. I would just like to make our case, sum up our case for why it's not even, I hardly better can find myself able to get my mouth around the words, we need a Women's History Month, duh. I just want to tell you about an email that I received on the 1st of March this year. It was from Barack Obama, and it was he sent me an email, and attached to the email was a document which was called the Presidential Proclamation Women's History Month 2014. And he went through, blah, 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 why we need Women's History Month, why we want to honour the contribution of American women, all the work that needs to be still done, and so on and so on. And he concluded this document by saying, as we honour the many women who've shaped our history, let us also celebrate those who make progress in our time, blah, 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 blah. Finished the document by saying, now therefore I, Barack Obama, President of the United States, by virtue of the authority vested in me by the Constitution and the laws of the United States, do hereby proclaim March 2014 as Women's History Month. I call upon all Americans to observe this month and to celebrate International Women's Day on March 8, 2014, with appropriate programs, ceremonies and activities. I also invite all Americans to visit our www.womenshistorymonth.gov website to learn more about the generations of women who have left enduring imprints on our history. In witness whereof I have hereunto set my hand this first day of March in the year of our Lord 2014. Now, if you think I'm going to email him back and ask him to unset his hand and cancel Women's History Month, you've got rocks in your heads. And what I'd like to say, not that we slavishly want to ape all things American, but one thing I would say is that the Americans have got it right here. They have this very serious month of activities, of celebrating, of pointing out what needs to be done, but it's also they have a party. This proclamation was the 1st of March. 2 days later, on the 3rd of March, they had a concert, an official function of Women's History Month, a concert at the White House featuring Aretha Franklin, who sang R-E-S-P-E-C-T, of course, and various other singers. It was called the Women of Soul Concert. And one of the things about having a special month is it enables you to both celebrate things, to mark things out, and to highlight in ways that our opposing team has been unable to do, why it is that we need to focus. We need to focus on events, we need to focus on achievements, and we need to focus even more so on what needs to be done. And I'm sure there are several, if not many of you in the audience who are as old as I am and who will remember the dark days of the Howard government when the Minister for Women, Jocelyn Newman, announced that she was going to mainstream women's policy. Henceforth, we wouldn't need special women's programs or women's offices or anything to do with women because we're going to mainstream. Now, that argument to me sounds very like we don't need a women's month. Let's have a whole year. Let's disappear within the year. You can imagine how much attention we'll get if we are supposed to compete with every other issue. It's no accident that you notice that more and more organisations, more and more groups, more and more causes want to have their special day, their special week, their special month, their special coloured ribbon. It's because we need to draw attention to ourselves. We need to remind people the struggle goes on. I haven't got time to give you all of the reasons why the struggle goes on. The statistics are very well known, why our fight continues, why we still are a long way off from achieving gender equality. But I'd just like to finish by making 2 points. The main reason we need Women's History Month is our task is so urgent now because of our Prime Minister. We have a Prime Minister in this country now who is so anti-women that the need for Women's History Month and the need to remind people of what we have achieved and what needs to be preserved has never been more urgent. Evidence of his anti-feminism, his anti-femaleness, his mother, Bronwyn Bishop, his daughters, the fillies, reminiscent of the Sydney Morning Herald last year, which Women of the Year was Black Caviar, a horse, like the Mums of the Year list. We as women, actual human women, don't even make it onto these lists. Tony Abbott's antipathy to women is evidenced in the fact he's only got one woman in his cabinet. by his announcement today that chastity belts are now going to be available on Medicare so women can protect their precious gift before they finally get pregnant and take advantage of his paid parental leave, which will enable women of calibre to get out of the workforce and into oblivion. That's his plan for us. Now, in this context, in this political environment, are we seriously going to abolish Women's History Month, the one time, the only time, 30 mere days where we have a chance to honour our past, celebrate our achievements, but most importantly, lay out the case for what still needs to be done? There's a hell of a lot to be done. We probably need... I can't tell you how much we need, but short of abolishing Women's History Month, it's only a short step then to abolishing women's history, and then we're on the slippery slope to abolishing women. And that's the agenda.
Thank you, Anne, and I'm not sure even the Prime Minister can manage to create a new generation of Australians without women. I'd now like to invite the adjudicators to withdraw, and we'll keep a respectful silence while you leave the room. I think we're now also going to bring a microphone to the centre of the floor, and we'll have space for questions, so please do have those questions prepared and ready. I'll have some of my own as soon as we've got the microphone available. So the idea here is that we form an orderly queue at the microphone, so up you come. Someone's going to be brave and start? Okay, look, I'll kick things off. And Angela, I might go to you first if I could. You spoke about second wave feminism and perhaps whether that might be a relic. I wondered whether you thought that that was something that was... Okay. All right. Okay. Marnie, you spoke of second wave feminism. And actually the question was going to be whether it's seen as something that's now unnecessary at a tertiary level, whether it's the same kind of relic as perhaps Marxist philosophy as a mainstream approach to the general. But would you like to address the place that second wave feminism holds in academia? I think you're going to have to come up to the lectern, unfortunately.
I think my point was actually, I think second wave feminism, first wave feminism have actually had... You get a good lot of knowledge out of it. If you look at the curriculum, you do see evidence of students studying around our contribution towards women achieving the vote and a good sense of second wave feminism. When I ask young women, they do tell me about those things. I guess the issue is what happens to those of us who come after second wave feminism? Nothing. How many waves are there? And my feeling is, do you need to be a big wave or a little wave? Sometimes I feel like it stops at second wave. And there needs to be a sense in which there can be an achievement and a story after that point, but there's also a really important story before that point. Not to diminish first and second wave, but there's really important stuff that needs to happen and is happening, and there's a deep history to women's history, and we need to be really aware of that.
Stay there. I haven't finished with you.
Marxism. You asked me about Marxism.
No. Let's leave Marxism for the moment. That's too intractable. Marxist philosophy is not something we can get through in the next 10 minutes. Marnie, I wonder though, I often have occasion to see in the studio, it happens from time to time, beautiful and brilliant young women, and the statement comes out, I'm not a feminist, but... I don't call myself a feminist, but... So what would third generation, third wave feminism look like, do you think? What's open to women who are, like you and I, beyond that second wave?
I think it's kind of interesting that participatory democracies change quite a lot. So people made their message in particular ways in the 60s and 70s, and things have changed quite a lot. So if you look at the ways in which young people participate in digital democracy initiatives, they just do it differently. So you look at popular polls like Get Up and you see a sense of grassroots activism around a whole lot of things. Maybe they say I'm not a feminist because we have this notion of what a feminist is, but feminism is much broader than that. And I think that we do need to actually broaden out our understanding of women's history to make sure that people understand that there's an opportunity for them to stand by it. And if you say you're a feminist, that doesn't mean you're a particular thing. It actually means that you're just interested in promoting the cause of women, whether you're a woman or a man.
Brave person standing in front of the microphone. Hello.
I'll disappear at this point. Alex can come up.
the debate, and I think it's really important. I agree with Anne Summers that making the case for Women's History Month all year is a hard thing to do, because it's wonderful to focus on one month. But I'm just wondering, the presentation started by saying this is the last Women's History Month, and I'm wondering, is that true?
Yes, it is true. Absolutely, it is true.
I'm amazed by that. And also, what else has happened this month around Women's History Month? I haven't heard very much, and I'm really disappointed now that it's the end of March, because we're all fired up for Women's History Month and it's over.
Thank you. In true Tony Jones style, because I can't answer all your questions, I'll take that as a comment. Yes.
I don't know how impartial this question is going to be, because my mother is debating on the negative.
Yo!
But my question is to the affirmative. You said you wanted women's history all year. What is the best way to focus this, if not Women's History Month? If we make aware of Women's History Month in a month, surely we can focus on it all year if we have this awareness. Where are we going to get the awareness from if we only have it all year?
Marilyn, step forward.
I see that as a bit of a contradiction, having it in 1 month or having it all year. I mean, women's history, as I said, in Australia has been an enormously successful collective enterprise over now some 40 or 50 years. And I also said, and I really mean this, it's provided a huge intellectual resource now for the nation, that is there for everybody to draw on. And in fact, if you go to the Women's History Month, which I should say is based in Canberra, it doesn't happen in Melbourne. We don't need it in Melbourne. But if you go to the Women's History Month website, which I did, of course, all the resources that they draw on there are taken from elsewhere, because these things are now widely available all over the place. So you have women's history all the time in terms of the research people are doing, in terms of what people write about, in terms of the books that are coming out. Every single month people are teaching in schools and in universities. They're writing books, they're doing reviews. Women's history is there all the time. They're doing commemorations. I can't think of a week that goes by without me thinking in some way about women's history.
It behooves me, as a proud resident of the ACT, to remind Marilyn that it was in this city that the Queen, the Governor-General, the Prime Minister and the Chief Minister walked together in a deeply historic moment, I think in Canberra. We're doing quite nicely, thank you.
But the Queen doesn't come from Canberra.
Fish fash, whatever. Piddle piddle. Let me go to our next question. I'm very pleased we've got a queue of young questioners. I think some of the rest of you could get up too, couldn't you? Don't leave it all to the next generation. Go ahead.
Good evening. I'm 16 and I go to a local high school, and I can attribute to the fact that the majority of women there unfortunately haven't even heard of Women's History Month, but have however seen the Sapphires and admire Rose as a female icon for saving the Titanic. Considering the resounding kind of lack of success Women's History Month has had in educating the next generation, why waste the resources when we've got people starving on the streets and crowded hospitals?
Oh. I'm not sure. Who wants to take that on? Go on. Marnie Hughes-Warrington, who never saw a question she couldn't argue.
It's an interesting question, because you've actually turned it back to a burden of the state issue, haven't you? You said actually we could fund hospitals, we could fund this. Actually, these things are intimately tied with one another. Now, you could say just because we haven't got it right doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it, right? It's incumbent upon them to demonstrate that we wouldn't be worse off without it. And that's the point, is we don't know because we haven't done it yet. The important thing is actually it is tied to livelihoods, that if women aren't aware, and it's important for us to get this right, because if they aren't aware, they end up in situations where they are financially more vulnerable and they are more likely to be probably susceptible to outcomes that are not good health outcomes and good quality of life outcomes. So they are not disconnected, these issues, regardless of what you guys would say. They are actually connected, and it's incumbent upon them to demonstrate that if we took it away, that we would be no worse off.
Marnie, while you're there, I'm sorry, again.
Just go for a second one there, Jennifer. My team here supporting me so well. Come on, guys.
I'm just wondering, there have been really interesting arguments made tonight about the separation of women's history from other history.
Sure.
What's the history of that academically? I presume that's a second wave feminist outcome.
No, not at all. You actually got, from the earliest times, you've actually got people writing women's history. So there are ancient examples of histories of women. Typically they're histories of good women and bad women, because there's lots of very bad mothers and there's a lot of long history of very bad mothers. So people felt compelled to write stories about women that were inspirational and should not have been inspirational. Lord knows what people made of the not inspirational women's stories. They might have found them actually quite inspirational, but there's a very, very long tradition of writing just women's history, and of course a long tradition of writing history that's about men and women and men and women, and all kinds of people connecting together as well. So yeah, it's an ancient tradition.
Okay.
I'm 17, and as a student of the modern schooling system, I just wanted to ask, do you believe that instead of being a section of general Australian history, that women's history should be an entirely separate subject choice for students?
Oh, that's an interesting idea. Angela Woolacott, would you like to respond to that?
I think we can do both. I think we need to have a section within a general course on Australian history or any other part of the world. You can't tell a national history or a regional history or a world history without having women in it and showing women's contributions, all of the multiple ways in which women have contributed socially, economically, through productive and reproductive labour to any part of the world. But we need to have as well particular subjects, studies, lectures, topics on women's history, because without doing both, we can't understand the significance of the ways in which women have had to face discrimination, fight against discrimination in its many religious, legal and social forms. So I think we don't have to, fortunately, choose. In fact, the way history is taught now, both in school and in universities, is a combination of those things, that we can have Australian history. I mean, for example, I taught a course last semester called Women and Men in Australian History, and I used the stories of an assorted group of significant women as part of telling the general story of Australian history from 1788 to the present. But we also need women's history as a separate focus.
Thank you, Angela. Thank you.
Hi, I'm also 17 and part of the modern schooling system, and I have a question sort of relating to the education, also that I'm not a feminist, but because a lot of people at school always say, especially girls at the school, they always go, oh, I'm not a feminist, but I do believe in equal pay. And do you think this is because they haven't been educated enough to know what they are open for and what they can have as women and what they can stand for in the school system?
Alex, I want to get you to come up and answer that, because I find this absolutely intriguing. I am astonished that there is, in many apparently intelligent, capable, thoughtful people, such a desire to dissociate themselves from the notion of feminism.
I definitely agree that for some reason over the last decade or so, I've seen more and more of my peers associate feminism as a dirty word. It's something that you don't want to be. But I think the reason is because all too often, and I think this is something that Marnie mentioned, there are these very narrow views of feminism. It must mean that you've got to take off your bra and go burn it and things like that. And that's not something that we all want to do. And yet, I think, yeah.
Not at any time soon.
No, thank you. And so I think there is this sort of misperceptions of feminism among many people of our generation. And yet I do think that more and more we are seeing that being challenged by, great women, by the fact that we've had, a female prime minister in the last few years, that we've got a female. Females in lots of great roles and high prominent roles, and we see that to achieve these kinds of things we do need to have feminism, because it does mean equal access to these kinds of positions and roles in Australian society. So although I agree that I've seen this happen too, I'd like to think that having all these prominent women is hopefully going to decrease, the association of feminism with obviously bra burning and bad things, because there is so much more to it than that.
Of course, you don't have to wear a bra if you don't want to. No one's making you do that. It's up to you girls, though. It is up to you to identify yourselves as feminists and to be proud of that. Thank you. Next question.
Hello, yes. I've got a question about Anne. Anne, on the agreeing team, you mentioned your email from Mr. Obama and how America supports Women's History Month. What sort of activities does America do in comparison to Australia?
Anne. Actually, as Anne's coming forward, it did occur to me that perhaps we might be able to get our head of state to proclaim something to do with Women's History Month. That'd be the Queen, wouldn't it? Do you think she'd get behind that?
Well, I don't know who's going to do it here. Hard to think of anybody within the current government who would put their names to a seal or a proclamation similar to the one that I read out. Look, I'm not able to give you a detailed list of all the things that happen, but I would suggest you go to that website that President Obama mentioned, which I think was just womenshistory.gov, and have a look there. But I mean, I just know from my observations over recent years that it's always an awful lot of things happening, both at a governmental level and at a community level and among women's organisations, and it's something that is taken very seriously in a way that's quite strange for the United States, because they don't do that in a lot of other areas. Yes. We are a country where such issues tend to be more perhaps taken up by government. You look at all the palaver that's growing up around the centenary of World War I and the next year's centenary of Gallipoli. It's the sort of thing that the Australian government does you don't see the Americans do as often. So it's quite interesting that Women's History Month has become something that's been taken up by government. But I think you'll find that it's celebrated and marked by organisations as well as government.
Well, that's interesting, because I hadn't heard of Women's History Month in Australia until I came here, actually. I was told about it at school. I thought, well, what sort of influence we're taking from America, if we're taking any at all. And I was very surprised that you have Mr. Obama's email as well. Which is
Well, I have to say it's very easy to get on his email list. They actually like it.
Also, don't discount the fact that Anne is a very powerful woman.
Yeah, Barack and I like that.
Go ahead.
I'm Margaret Berlin from the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. And next year, that organisation celebrates its centenary just 3 days differently from Anzac's centenary. And so I'm very interested in women's peace history. And I don't think we have an overabundance of women's peace history in Australia or throughout the world. And I'm therefore wondering which side is going to suggest they can do a better job next year in dealing with women's peace history. Just in March, or would that be the start, or the whole year? And if it was the whole year, how could we manage that?
Dawn Casey, I'm going to go to you on the notion of contested history and how to represent it. Contested history and how to represent it. This notion that we need to tell an entire story as we're looking at these centenaries of the First World War and of Anzac Day, and how do we take up those cudgels?
Well, I'd definitely be the wrong person, wouldn't I? I was sacked by the Prime Minister.
I know, that's why I asked you.
Look, I think it's incredibly important to deal with contested histories, but you must do it, you should do it, in a way that will engage those disbelievers. There's absolutely no point in preaching to the true believers. So, and that's what we really attempted to do at the National Museum in a range of areas, not just with Indigenous history, but also the various cultural groups that came to this country. Because you really have to break down the barriers and let people be safe, feel that they're safe when they're dealing with contested history. But you don't walk away from it. You don't walk away from it.
It's an extraordinary observation, though, that we should discuss that in the context of women and peace, that people need to be made to feel safe with that when we are so comfortable with the history of war.
I agree.
Yeah.
I agree. But, I think it wasn't until, and my colleague historians would know much better than me, that but it wasn't that long ago where we didn't have women represented in the Australian War Memorial. We still haven't got Indigenous, in there in terms of the frontier conflict. I suspect we've got a long way to go.
Next question, and I think perhaps this is our last. We might be close to having the adjudicators return, perhaps. Go ahead.
I came along here tonight hoping that it would be explained to me exactly what women's history is these days. And I think that I've got the message that it's the fact that women have children and that women can be just as important as men and therefore deserve a place in history. However, I can remember some time ago having an argument with people, which I lost, that people like Napoleon and Alexander the Great and Peter the Great should not be regarded as great people because they were in fact very destructive men who just managed to impose their will upon the world and create chaos for many. Now, is it possible that women's history could be taking a women's perspective on how history has been viewed, so that a woman historian might perhaps look at people like this who have been revered and say, no, from a woman's point of view, these men were not great, they were assholes.
Who would like to respond to whether it's possible to take that on? We have a few... And Summers, I'm going to go to you on that, actually. Someone has to.
Thanks. I think it's a very valid point, and I think that it's worth remembering that when some of us started writing history of women and history of Australia back in the early 1970s, that it began as a critique of the mainstream history, and it began as a critique of the ways in which women had been left out of the story of our country, and that implicit in that critique was some criticisms of some of the heroes of our national story, the way it had been written in the past. So I think that some critique of the existing story and some of the characters within it was always part of the project of what we did. I'm no longer really involved in women's history, so I can't say what's happening today, but that was certainly one of the things that motivated me when I wrote my book back in 1975, and that was to not just inject women back into the story, but to try and account for why we'd been left out in the first place. And in trying to answer that second question, you had to make some judgments on the people who'd done the leaving out.
Do we have any further questions from the floor? No? Okay. We go. Just one more. We'll sneak you in. Come up and ask. Okay, you do. You need to vote. We need to get you to vote in a moment. So come up. Your last question. Off you go.
Thank you. Matilda Keynes from the History Teachers Association of Victoria. Just a quick question that just sprung to my mind. We have a lot of students doing history in Year 12, but they seem to be the revolutions is the first choice for most people, not an Australian history is sort of on the downhill, but in the middle school we've got the new curriculum which focuses more on more diverse histories, and I'm just wondering how can we at the Year 12 level kind of encourage Australian history and women's history, or how do you account for this focus on revolutions and them being cool and fun? How do we make women's history, Australian history, cool and fun?
That's a perennial question for all teachers of history, isn't it? How is women's history and Australian history cool and fun? Now, I think that probably everyone on the panel would like $1 for every time they've thought of that. Angela, shall I go to you?
Am I understanding the question right, that you're asking about how we can include women's history when the focus has been on revolutions? Yeah. Well, I think we need to see what women have achieved as revolutionary. I think we need to see all of the achievements of feminists over centuries as revolutionary, and the inclusion of women in political and economic and social power, women receiving legal rights that they had not before as revolutionary. We could easily cast women's history in that framework because it has been. For women to become as equal as we are now has been revolutionary in political, legal, social, religious, cultural ways. So I think we could certainly celebrate it that way and study it that way.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, now I am going to first of all ask you to thank by acclamation all of our debaters this evening. It's It's been a wonderfully diverse and opinionated series of speeches. It's been a terrific experience for all of us, I think, but the time comes now for us to vote, to make our decision, regardless of what the adjudicators locked up in a room at the back of Albert Hall may or may not think. Now, we're going to do this by a show of hands. So I'd like to ask first for all those, who are voting in the affirmative that Australia doesn't need Women's History Month to raise their hands and keep them raised while our scrutineers are counting you. That Australia doesn't need Women's History Month. Raise your hands. I'm tempted to do it on the voices because that's just such a Canberra thing to do. But okay, we'll count. Our scrutineers are hard at work. Keep your hand up. Okay, have we made our count? All right, so those who believe that the negatives case, now how am I going to phrase this, that Australia doesn't not need Australia's history, a Women's History Month, those who are voting for the opposition case, raise your hands. All right. I don't think we've rigged or gerrymandered anything. I think that's a fairly clear decision. I'll ask now the adjudicators to return, and we're going to hear from each of them and hear them describe their case. They'll be in just a moment. I hope they've made their minds up. They couldn't have possibly guessed what all of you thought, could they? Who knows? I'm going to introduce you now to each of our adjudicators, and we'll begin with Daryl Karp, who is Director of the Museum of Australian Democracy at Old Parliament House in Canberra. She's a former CEO and Managing Director of Film Australia and Head of Factual Programs TV at the ABC. Daryl, welcome.
Thank you. And thank you, Genevieve. And unlike Genevieve, I have never debated, so I don't actually have any rules to fall back on, so I'm going to use my film skills and to say that I approached it as I would when I sit there in a screening when everyone turns to you and say, well, what do you think? So for those of you who've worked with me previously, the key things that I always say is why this, why now? Why are we telling this story right now? And by that I mean, you know, what are we saying that's new? How is it relevant to what's going on at the moment? I also consider the setup. We want to avoid what I call in TV parlance the really interesting, worthy but dull. And I do have to say that in terms of setup, the opposition speakers did have an advantage. As you said, they had props and that lovely line of the blue tie of history. And they also had a second prop with Obama's letter. And let's face it, if you're talking about capturing an audience and cutting through the background noise of media, Obama really does do it, even if he is a bloke. And then, of course, there's the notion of story. And I felt that in all of them, all of the speakers were just terrific. There was a wonderful sense of detail. There was great reference to the internet, to our key significant women. But in terms of storytelling, setup, humour, I'm going to go in terms of the manner of speaking to say that I think that the opposition speakers were more successful than the government speakers.
It has to be someone from film who appreciates the value of props, doesn't it? Associate Professor Tony Taylor is a member of the Faculty of Arts and Education in Federation University, and that's a new collaboration between the University of Ballarat and Monash University's Gippsland campus. He was Director of the Commonwealth's National Centre for History Education from 2001 to 2007, a National Curriculum Consultant to the Commonwealth Government from 2008 to 2012, and he's also a frequent columnist on history and education matters. Please welcome Tony.
Thank you, and it's a great pleasure to be here. I must say, having listened to the speakers as carefully as I could, they were so different in their styles and their approaches that was one of the remarkable features of the evening. On examining the whole debate, one of the things that I was really interested to see was if the government side, having put forward a proposition for the abolition of Women's History Month, could come up with a very strong set of alternatives. Now, in a way, my view of this was that they didn't quite reach the mark on that. There was a great deal of discussion about options that were available. So, in a way, by abolishing Women's History Month, it seemed to me that there was no viable option offered as a follow-up or a consequence of that kind of abolition. The second point I think that came across for me was there were contradictions between the arguments within the government team, and the opposition team seemed much more coherent and much more had a much more carefully arranged set of arguments. So on that basis, I'm going to award, in my case, the evening's debate to the opposition.
It's the moment of truth from my debating days. It was either the crest of a wave or that sinking feeling. And if it was that sinking feeling, that was quickly followed by how soon can we get to the sandwiches? Professor Kim Rubenstein is Director of the Centre for International and Public Law in the ANU College of Law. She was the inaugural convener of the ANU Gender Institute. She is currently running an oral history project entitled Trailblazing Women and the Law, and she'll present the final conclusion for the adjudicators.
Well, I want to thank the organisers for a really stimulating evening. I was really grateful that I was asked to be an adjudicator rather than a speaker, and I really want to pay tribute to each of the 6 speakers tonight for an absolutely stunning and sensational presentation. I thought Angela Woolacott set it off really well. I felt she really captured our minds because, of course, we were expecting her to say, we've reached the stage where we don't need Women's History Month anymore. We've reached a stage where we've achieved equality. But no, she did the exact opposite. And I felt it would be really interesting to see if she'd trumped the debate, that she'd effectively made it a non-debate, because, of course, they'd be all agreeing about the fact that we need to pay more attention to women, not only through Women's History Month, but throughout the whole year. So I thought she set up a very high standard for the opposition to have to deal with that twist in the argument. But Alex, as the seasoned debater, did her fair share, and I think throughout the rest of her team tonight, they were able to acknowledge that they were a little bit stumped by the opposition, but came up with some way of disputing the notion that a year would be better than a month, and were able to slowly pull away from me my sense that they'd got it right from the start, that they'd been too clever. But in essence, because of the comments that my co-adjudicators have presented tonight, we as adjudicators had to draw on chose in the debating wall to draw on 3 aspects for tonight: the manner in which the speakers presented, the method and the matter. And we felt that overwhelmingly the matter was really strong for each of the speakers tonight. And so I think as an audience we were treated to an equal presentation of strong material that was convincing, in effect, all of them convincing us that we need more women's history. And so then it came down to the method and the manner. And ultimately, through Daryl's comments and Tony's comments about the manner and the method, the overwhelming unanimous decision was that the opposition were the winners of the debate tonight. But I wanted to finish off, and having the privilege of finishing off, listening to Marnie talk about one of her examples in relation to Eve, I felt that we really needed to end off the night tonight with this particular quote, this particular joke, which is priceless. One day, in the Garden of Eden, Eve calls out to God, "Lord, I have a problem." "What's the problem, Eve?" "Lord, I know you created me and provided me this beautiful garden and all of these wonderful animals, but I'm just not happy. Why is that, Eve? Came the reply from above. Lord, I'm lonely and I'm sick to death of apples. Well, Eve, in that case, I have a solution. I shall create a man for you. What's a man, Lord? A man is a flawed creature with many bad traits. He'll lie, cheat, and be very competitive. All in all, he'll give you a hard time, but he'll be bigger, faster, and will like to hunt and kill things. He will be witless and will revel in childish things like fighting and kicking a ball around. He won't be too smart, so he'll also need your advice to think properly. Sounds great, said Eve with an ironically raised eyebrow. But what's the catch, Lord? Well, you can have him on one condition. What's that? As I said, he'll be proud, arrogant, and self-admiring, so you'll have to let him believe that I made him first. Just remember, it's our little secret. You know, woman to woman.
What a fabulous way to end. And adjudicators, let me tell you that in fact your decision and the decision of the audience was exactly the same. It's a win on both counts for the opposition. Many thanks to our adjudicators tonight. Please thank Daryl Karp, Tony Taylor and Kim Rubenstein. And I'd now like to invite Lenore Colthart to close the evening for us. Lenore.
Thanks, Genevieve. And thank you for your terrific work tonight. Wow, what a star. We knew this would be good. And of course, the constellation of our debaters, our adjudicators, and Genevieve was a wonderful mix. Thank Dawn and Tony and Marilyn and Anne for travelling here to join our local stars, Angela, Marnie and Alex. And I also want, now this is going to be a vote of thanks, but I'm not going to ask you to applaud everybody. Just wait till the end and we'll make it one huge big thing for all the stars. I want to thank our sponsors, Brendan O'Donnell from Corvus Creative and Carolyn Brooks, the designers, Marilyn Chalkley, a Women's History Month supporter from way back, whose very delicate tribute to Women's History Month Australia 2014 will shortly be unveiled, to Forbes and Forbes Wines, another delight in store for you, to Hudson's Catering for coming to the party, to Nairi Gamak and Christine Ryan from the Horticultural Society of Canberra. Now, we are proud in Canberra of being a garden city, and here is autumn on display. Absolutely superb, and it is a gesture of support from the Horticultural Society to Women's History Month that we're very grateful for. A wonderful supporter, a long-time supporter of lots of causes and activities and civic energy in Canberra, Di Johnston, to the Women's History Month teams past, and to the present organisers, my colleagues Pamela Harris, Sandy Forbes, Janet Wilson, Pauline McDonough, Libby Coates, all women who can move mountains, and they do, and to their families who actually quite literally moved everything tonight, and to our fabulous teams of student helpers from Canberra Grammar, from St Clair's and Narrabundah College, Laura Chung, Rani Niparis, George Lean, Isabel Wilson, Dia Sharma, Eloise Robertson and Amelia Gunneridge. A fantastic job. I can't tell you how many times I said, I don't know how to do this, but I'll come back in a minute. And in a minute, it was wonderful. It was a great experience. Colin Towns for the terrific audio and air conditioning, and for lots of help behind the scenes. The flourish that is going to make this available online, Gavin Tapp from ACT Government Information Office, and his team, who were so busy tonight, and everyone who managed not to trip over a tripod or a cable, thank you too. But the debate will be available online through the terrific Canberra Live website and also on YouTube. If you look at the womenshistory.net.au website, we'll make the links live when that's available very shortly. We welcome your comments about the future of Women's History Month via the website because, of course, the organising team realised that we can stop working on Women's History Month, but we actually can't stop Women's History Month. It suddenly occurred to me. A wonderful night. And, of course, thanks to you, the terrific audience. The questions were wonderful. What a vibe in the Albert Hall. There's been many an occasion in the Albert Hall's history where women were front and centre, and they are again tonight. This was terrific to hear the resonance of that. So now's the moment for the applause. Thank you, one and all.